welcome everyone to today's Know Your Neighbor series presented by the city's Diversity and Inclusion Committee in this virtual format. Wishing we could all be together and holding these at Twilliger's Lodge as we normally do, but this will have to do in a pinch. Want to thank everyone for coming out this evening, and I also would like to pass along regrets from City Manager Brian Riblett as well as Mayor DeBrosi. This effort is very important not only to the City Council but to staff, and they would have loved to be here but did have previous commitments. So to get started, for those of you who don't know me, I am Tracy Annell, Assistant City Manager for the city and part of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, along with some other staff members that you might see as panelists here. The Diversity and Inclusion Committee, if you don't know, was founded in 2018, and the committee is led by citizen volunteers of various races, faiths, nationalities, ages, and life experiences. It is joined by City Council members, I believe Ms. Councilmember Source probably on the line this evening, as well as several staff members, including the City Manager and Chief of Police. This here is just a list of our members. As you can see, we have a pretty wide diversity here on our committee, which just lends to the strength of the committee and does include both staff and City Council. Just a little bit on our accomplishments. The Diversity and Inclusion Committee has had multiple sessions and events, and I think some of you may even have attended some of our dinners in the park where you got to know some of your neighbors. And we hope to be able to bring that back as soon as COVID will allow, but we have been able to attract and reach more than 300 people with some of our Know Your Neighbor series. And in 2020, we are proud to announce that we were honored with the Climb Award for inclusion and by the Cincinnati Business Courier. So it's quite the honor to receive that award. This evening, we're super excited to have you here to hear the presentation History of Race in America, presented by our own Chris Burns and Dell Carter, who are members of our commission. As we are reminded every day, we still have a lot of work to do, as we've been hearing in the news about the attacks on Asian Americans, and we are all tuned into the trial for George Floyd. So we're constantly reminded that this work is so important and that we have so much left to do. We have been blessed to hear this presentation already by Chris and Dell, and I know that you will be just floored by how much information they will share with you today based on the book Stamped from the Beginning, and it is a real treat, and I hope that you enjoy the presentation. If you do have any questions, feel free to use the chat function. Matthew Vanderhorst will be monitoring that, and we will answer questions at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chris Burns and Dell Carter.
Thanks, Tracy. My name is Lydell Carter. I am a resident of Montgomery, product of Sycamore, born and raised in the area, all through grade school and on up through high school. I have a family that lives in Montgomery, and I have 3 young kids that are of mixed background. My mom is white, my dad is Black and Native American. So throughout my personal background, we've always discussed race and interactions between different groups. My dad was a big proponent of equality, along with my mom and her work down at the VA hospital. So my involvement in the committee, and when I joined, Chip, our chair of the diversity committee, had asked Chris and I to put together a presentation based on the book by Ibram Kendi called Stamped from the Beginning. And so why present this? Everything that was going on last summer with Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, like Tracy had mentioned, it was very timely for our committee to really dive deep into the history of racism. And hopefully this presentation does a good job of condensing, let's see, about a 500-page book down into a few slides with the help of Chris. Chris, did you want to jump in just for a quick intro before we get started?
Sure. My name is Chris Burns. I'm a lifelong Cincinnati resident. I've been in Montgomery for 31 years. Both my daughters were born and raised here and attended Sycamore schools as well. And I'm a historian. through Civil War, Reconstruction, and Civil Rights era. So I've written and spoke about some of these issues for the last really about 6 years. So when Chip brought this up to Dell and I thought it was important to discuss this. And it's not just about African Americans, although much of it is. It's also with what happened in Florida recently with the Asian Americans. It's with all Americans. So we're going to be talking about the racism, the whole mentality of it, and speaking about that as it affects all of us, white, African-based, Asian. It doesn't make any difference because we've all been, and or all of our ancestors have been persecuted at one time or another in this country.
Thanks, Chris. So slide 1 here, Jefferson Davis, 1860. So he was the first and only Confederate president of the Confederacy. And Kendi got the title from Jefferson Davis's quote saying, inequality between Black and white races was quote unquote stamped from the beginning. So from the beginning of time, there was this division, this deep-rooted division between the Black and white races, according to Jefferson Davis. So there is some truth to that in that, history of racism, as I'll go into, goes back to the BC time. So in Kendi's book, that's where we start. And unfortunately, we're still dealing with those issues today in 2021. Through Kendi's book, he depicts 3 viewpoints on racial inequality: segregationist, which is complete separation of the races, of all races; assimilationist, which is basically you're learning to live, or for worse of a better term, tolerate each other. And then the last viewpoint is anti-racist. So where people actively seek action against, where they see racism, bias, unjust laws, ways to really promote equality that may have been baked in through systemic racism through the years. So I think as a country, as a community, as humans today, we're challenged with moving from kind of an assimilationist idea in theory and moving more towards moving the needle more towards moving to an anti-racist where we're sticking up for each other, where we're actively seeking what's good for me is good for my neighbor. We're protecting our neighbors. So on the next slide, we have a term called social construct. So in our view, in Kendi's view, race is a social construct. So what do I mean by a social construct? It exists because human says it exists. So that's the most basic primitive definition of a social construct. Prime example that I think everybody's familiar with is money. So I agree that the dollar that I have right now, you agree that if I give you $1, it's worth $1. I think that's the most simple social construct that comes to mind when I think of that. It's designed, it's made up by humans. Now, when you move to race being a social construct, that creates a whole misalignment of what race is. And that's where the conflict, disagreement, stereotypes are all birthed from, is this idea that race really exists. During the 1990s, the DNA genome project had been completed in the 1990s, and DNA was fully mapped. The human genome was fully mapped. And ironically, there is more genetic deviation within race groups, as we categorize them, than between races. So there is more genetic deviation between groups of Caucasians, between groups of African Americans, between groups of Native Americans, than there is crossing over between whites and blacks, Caucasians, African Americans. Then another insight that was listed in the New York Times a while ago was only 3 of the 30,000 genes in the DNA, only 3 in the 30,000 genes determine your outward appearance. So race being a social construct made up by humans. You'll see in the next several slides some of the viewpoints and categories being religion, economy, science, education, legal and political, and why this social construct played out through those various lenses. Next slide, please. If we want to go back just one slide, thank you. So in terms of religion, like I said before on the opening slide, the hierarchy and classifying humans by hierarchy dates back to 384 BC with Aristotle. So there's been a long history of humans segregating humans. Aristotle first came up with the first loosely based hierarchy with the definition of a natural slave, in the sense that if you were captured through war or made to work or worked for a master, you were predetermined to be a slave because you succumbed to slavery. And on the flip side, if you were a master because you were given that birth-given right to enslave other people. So that started back in the 384 BC. As we moved closer to the 1600s on through 384 to the 1600s, there's another theory that really dominated thought back then, which is the climate theory. And that's the sense that black skin was caused by the sun, specifically the climate and the tropical regions. Going a step further, the black skin had become black because it was overexposed to harsh climates, specifically the sun. So because you were exposed to the sun during this time, as a people, you were less intelligent, you were more aggressive, and you were more animal-like, is what the climate theory basically boils down to. As we move from 800 to 1600, there was a development of the curse theory. So over 800 years of curse theory dominating thought. This stems from the biblical story of Noah's son, Ham, being cursed with blackness for a sin he had committed on Noah's Ark. And they're black because either, today under the curse theory, you're black either because you had sinned or you were related some ancestral line to Ham and you were paying for your ancestors' sin. So that's what caused the black skin underneath, according to this curse theory. As we move through 1600s up into the 1700s, we start to see the colonization of what we know now today as the United States. There's two major predominant religious groups during that time, the Quakers and the Puritans. Quakers were the first to arrive, and they were the first group of white groups of people to actively denounce slavery. The Puritans, on the other hand, had legalized slavery due to profits, tobacco trade, and economic necessity. During the time, Puritans were the dominant religion, and they used the support of slavery to justify slavery dating back to the biblical curse theory. Next slide, please. Second category, science and education. So under these themes, you use science to justify racial differences in hierarchy. So scientific racism is what dominated from the 1600s to 1945. They looked to science to defend racial differences and create hierarchies between the races. More along the lines of darker that your skin complexion, the lower you were on the hierarchy scale. The whiter your skin or the fairer your skin, the higher you were up in society and along the hierarchy lineage. Some of the major events that happened during this time, science and intellectual schools were established, which rejected the climate and Ham theory, but then gave way to the hierarchy, which wasn't based on any found science. Ironically, in 1721, there was a master out of Boston, I believe, that had a slave. And this is when they had a really big smallpox outbreak. And he asked his slaves, why don't you get smallpox? Coming over from Africa, you're not exposed to some of the symptoms that the slaves from Haiti and other areas were exposed to. And they said for centuries, our tribal chief in Africa had been inoculating us by taking the thorn of a branch, poking an infected person, and kind of inoculating some of the slaves or some of the countrymen during centuries ago. So that practice had been in place for centuries before even coming to the Americas. Double-edged sword that actually allowed for the mass transportation of slaves because they were inoculated and immune to smallpox. 1790, there was a concept called uplift suasion. So under this idea that dominated amongst the Black community was, if I align myself to the ways of my master, if I talked like a Caucasian, if I acted Caucasian, if I studied the same religion as my Caucasian master, then I could uplift my people collectively to another level. During that time, there was also a term called the extraordinary Negro, which is kind of a counterbalance to the uplift suasion, saying, well, if you are able to lift yourself up to that next level, you must be one of 1 million, one of 2 million extraordinary Negroes that was actually able to lift above that. So it was very much a push-pull relationship. 1830s, early 1800s, there was a dominant theatrical blackface was developed, and that spread internationally, which really disserviced the Black community in that it portrayed Blacks as silly, obedient, scared, and this basically dominated the early entertainment scene all the way up through Jim Crow era. Next slide, please. The third category, economic. Basically, this is the most significant factor through Kendi's book to defend slavery and racism. There is a pattern to protect the economy by protecting the institution of slavery, whether through harsh slave codes, whether through the legal system, as I'll explain on the next slide. This really was the underlying theme to promote slavery from 1452 all the way up through 1800s. A total of 12 million slaves were taken from Africa during the slave trade. So that doesn't include any kind of lineage or children that were born, the ancestral line while they're in Africa. These are actual Africans that were taken from Africa that amounted to 12 million people. Some of the major events during the underlying economic phase. So Portugal was the first one to really have a significant slave trade boom, and they were the first to sail to the west coast of Africa to transport slaves. Next was Britain, and Britain actually entered the slave trade to expand their navy. So they used the profits of the slave trade to actually expand their navy, which allowed them to colonize various regions across the world. Here in the United States, they had two big booms that relied heavily on slavery. Early 1600s was a tobacco boom and created the need for cheap labor to harvest the land. And then again, the cotton boom and the invention of the cotton gin required a mass increase in the number of slaves needed. So there was, during the cotton boom time, there was a 70% increase in slaves to meet the demand, where slaves went from 600,000 at the time and exploded to about 4 million at the time. And that was to help fuel 3/4 of the world's cotton was being produced in the United States during that time. Both the United States and England ended the slave trade in 1810, but did not outlaw the slavery. So that was able to, you couldn't slave trade transatlantically, but you could still have slaves and breed slaves, and any slave born within as a slave would continue to be a slave. The last category, as far as a social construct really fueling slave or supporting slavery, is the legal political aspect. And these are really laws and policies designed to protect the institution of slavery. one of the more important cases done underneath our major events here. And I encourage everybody to look at these individual major events because it really shows some of the push-pull relationship back then between groups of people. So progress was made by African Americans, and then that was met with sharp resistance through either slave codes or the development in the rise of the KKK. One of the more important cases that I'll just touch on briefly is in 1676, the Bacon's Rebellion. And this was during the time where there was really a class warfare between the small, let's just say what we know now as the top 1%, plantation owners who owned mass number of slaves. And during that time, there were also poor white slaves, indentured servants. There were Native Americans that were working some of these fields, and they realized that the power and the rebellion that Bacon had caused was a unification between the lower income, middle income against the top 1%. Then the top 1% had instituted these new laws that actually required or recruited the low income whites to help police their plantations, which you create, instead of a class warfare, now you've created a race warfare between black and white, even raising them up between low income white to now you're being kind of the police of my plantation to police the slaves, really created that separation of races in the early to late 1600s. And you can see that play out today, the slave codes and I think the new frontier now is the election laws that are being instituted or trying to be pushed through across the United States, specifically in Georgia as a recent example. Next, I'll turn it over to Chris for his presentation section.
Thanks, Dell. I'm going to talk just a few minutes about a timeline, and Dell touched on some of this earlier as he talked about this is not all inclusive. He talked about the Portuguese who are not on here. So I didn't include them all, but I wanted to give an example of a variety of different, not only European nations, but world nations and how and when they immigrated to the United States. Starting with the Spanish, as you can see, then Africans in the 1619, Dutch, Germans, French. All of the early ones other than Africans were Western Europeans escaping, as Dell kind of pointed out, either religious persecution or getting away from wars, famines, and other issues that were out there. Some of them just wanted to leave, period. And some came over, as he said, were enslaved. Others were indentured servitude and had to serve a certain time for their masters and then were free. But in any case, everybody on this list, except the noble Englishmen and a few others, were persecuted at one time or another. So my family's background are Irish and German. The Irish came over in the 1830s to escape a potato famine in Ireland that killed hundreds of thousands. And they came through New Orleans and went up into the Plains states, Nebraska, Kansas, to get away from the big cities because they didn't want to get into areas that they might be persecuted. My mother's family came from Germany in the 1870s during the Wars for Unification, which is when Germany actually became its own nation. And they came over and they were persecuted in the 19-teens during World War I, because that's who we were fighting, as well as the 1920s. So again, every immigrant that came over here at one time or another was persecuted. One of the things that has happened to help divide some of the Western Europeans is they look pretty much alike, meaning they're all white, light-skinned, etc. So sooner or later they fit in one way or another. They found their niche, unlike African Americans, unlike Middle Eastern, Asians that we're still seeing today that are being persecuted. Next slide, please. So during this time, we're up to the Civil War, there were several ideas and legislation that occurred to help combat and reduce or end racism. The first one started with President Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, which did not really outlaw slavery in its entirety. It outlawed slavery in the Confederate States and the areas that were basically run by Confederates, because some of the states had areas that were still run by Unionists in those states. Thank you. And so it wasn't universal. However, they began to leave the areas even that were not included in that, because the Union armies began to go further south, and the escaped enslaved people by the hundreds of thousands came through the Union lines between 1863 and the end of the war. 1865, when the war ended, to 1870 was a new dawn for African Americans. Through several things that happened, the three most important in that time were the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery officially, the 14th Amendment, which had several pieces to it, but for this talk, the one that is most important is it allowed anyone born on American soil to become what they called naturalized citizens, which meant you had US citizenship. You could vote, you could take part in all things that were considered American. That was true of all races, of anybody here except Native Americans. The 15th Amendment basically allowed all men other than Native Americans to vote. It should have done it for women, but it didn't. They had to wait another 50 years, unfortunately. But those three amendments were supposed to help end or stop racism, immigration issues, and voting rights. As we know, we're still talking about those issues 150 years after that, and now they're all still in the news because we never solved it when we should have. So I'm not going to read all of these, but the next one that's really important is Reconstruction. I learned in my classes that it was a complete failure, that we gave the rights to many former slaves and that they completely were disastrous. Actually, the opposite is true. Over 1,000 former slaves and freedmen held public offices in this country, mainly in the South, as high as United States congressmen and United States senators. It was incredibly successful in that period of time for them. Unfortunately, we had to have US military force down in those areas. President Grant sent the military into both South Carolina and into Louisiana during this time to ensure that all people had a right to vote, not only former enslaved people, but also Republicans that were down there. Unfortunately, as we all know, that all ended and the Jim Crow laws began to rise. The KKK and other white supremacist groups that took over because Grant essentially destroyed the Klan by the time his presidency ended in 1877. And we are left with, without slavery, but certainly with too many issues that racism was still alive and well. So in the early 1900s, the NAACP was formed, as you can say, the National Urban League. And again, I'm going to jump forward to the 1950s and 60s with the Civil Rights Movement. And during that time, the 1860s, three major bills were passed. 1964, the Civil Rights Bill, which outlawed any kind of segregation or desegregation, with the segregation in any kind of public area. The next one was the Voting Rights Act, which filled in many of the holes that the 15th Amendment left open. And finally, in 1968, the Fair Housing Law. Despite all of that, in the last 150 years, as we know, racism still endures. Next slide, please. And so the past 50 years, Dell and I are going to talk briefly about in 1968, after the civil rights movement began on its dissension, I would say, and we have the rise of riots in Watts, an LA suburb in 1965, followed by 67 and 68 to more than 100 cities across America. President Nixon ran on law and order, so we expanded police forces, and prisons were expanded as well.
President Kennedy during the 1960s is when affirmative action really was implemented and took off. And I think the goal of the affirmative action was, to create a level playing field for those that didn't have the opportunity years ago to really rise to the same level as where they should have been under fair treatment. I think it was really tested within corporations, but I think the intent was corporations to begin with, which quickly led into education, and I think that's still a very hotly contested. Um, whether it's right, whether it's wrong, whether it's fair, but it has lifted a number of people who normally wouldn't have had those opportunities to the next level of higher education.
And we've attempted to desegregate schools, which supposedly happened in 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education, as well as busing. But those attempts have failed because of movements by different races in certain areas, away from certain areas. So there's no way really to enforce it. At least we have not found a way to do that at this point in time.
First African-American president, Barack Obama. I think even from a symbolic perspective, having the first African-American leader of the free world in the 2000s goes a long way to show how far we've come as a country in, seeing beyond just the skin color of somebody, but then really acknowledging their leadership skills. How are they able to bring people together and solve these big issues? On the uglier side of that, I think you really saw extreme pushback. One example in particular, was Barack Obama even born in the United States? Was he even eligible to be president? Kind of the birther myth, which is an attempt to kind of discredit the first African-American president.
And as we all know, we're still divided today by race, politics, and religion, but more so, as I've studied history, more so politically than we have ever been divided before. And that's become a major issue. And I believe it's the fringes that are getting the most attention, unfortunately, and the people in the middle, the silent, whatever percentage of what I consider myself, 70% or whatever, need to become certainly more vocal. And when we are beginning to do that.
And we see this play out time over time with the media. And I think, similar how it's been so polarizing between red, between blue, I think the media, feeds into that dysfunction. And I think, whether you're red or blue, whatever news source you listen to, I think, goes far beyond just reporting on the facts or cherry picking the facts. They seem to have, an underlying agenda that's decided at the top to really, promote their base, to really bring on people that they know will fire up their base without really going across various channels to make sure, it's fact checked, it's true, it's accurate. Just as politics are so polarized nowadays, the media, I would say, is even more so.
Completely agree. They just throw more fuel on the fire instead of attempting to solve some of the issues on there. So again, we're still trying to resolve the discrimination, immigration, and voting rights that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed to help to reduce or eliminate. Next slide. So finally, where do we go from here? And this is what this committee was started out, a commission began that Chip Herod started 3 years ago. And we have some bullet points here, some things that we have done and some things that we hope that you do in the next few weeks, months, or whatever, to help solve these problems and help us come together and celebrate our commonalities as well as our differences, because it's important for all of us to live in this same nation. So be deliberate about creating an inclusive and multicultural city. And I believe Montgomery is doing that.
Review all policies in marketing for implicit bias. Are we making sure that all of our policies and procedures, hiring techniques, hiring application forms, are they really bringing in top talent on a level playing field?
And one of the things that I've seen, actually two of the things I've seen during the past year and a half after the Floyd shooting or Floyd murder rather, is that in studying history in the past, many organizations have attempted to at least reduce racism and promote desegregation and the commonalities. But never before have the CEOs of major companies like Procter & Gamble, like Kroger's, like Fifth Third, Cincinnati Bell, et cetera, and those are just the ones in this region, as well as police chiefs from around the country stand up and try and point out the bad eggs that might be on their forces. That's never happened before. So I believe that we're in an era here with that kind of pressure coming from the top, from law enforcement, as well as from corporate America, that we have the best chance that we've had in our history to begin to really reduce this and create a society where all people are welcome.
Conduct business with companies that are diverse and inclusive. So I mean, this is on us really as consumers within our market, within our economy. Support companies that are willing to support our values. I think my wife Lisa introduced me to a concept that just really resonated, saying you vote with your dollar. Every dollar that you spend with a company is you're casting one more vote to supporting that company. I think as a community that we can really foster diversity and really reward those companies who are willing to not only promote diversity, but then also go beyond and foster inclusion within their workforce, within their hiring practices, and within their products.
And as we've seen through history, most effective protests and movements start local and expand outward from that. The civil rights movement didn't just begin on a national level. King joined that, Dr. King joined that once it had already been up and running. And what he saw was there was no face to it. So he became, no national face, I should say. He became the national face of that. And that's what we've tried to do here in Montgomery, is create a movement that we can start to make Montgomery a very inclusive city first and foremost. And as Dell pointed out earlier, or I'm sorry, as Tracy pointed out earlier, we won a major award from the Business Courier last year for what our efforts are. We now have cities calling us from different parts of the country, wanting to know how we've accomplished this, as well as other cities that are local in this area. So it's starting to grow, the movement's growing, our work is being felt and heard. And I can say, I honestly am blessed to be in this city, to live here at this time, and to be able to work with so many people who understand a different aspect of these issues that we're dealing with today.
All right. Thank you, Chris and Dell. That was a really super informative presentation. I've heard it once already, and I think I learned more today, so I really appreciate it. If anybody has any questions they want to ask, please type it in the chat, and we'll ask Chris and Dell about it. We have a question here. How is economic diversity encouraged in the city of Montgomery? Tracy, that may be a question for you.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. So that is one of the things that we are working on at the city level. One thing that we did with the committee is actually met with the leaders of our different chambers throughout greater Cincinnati. So we met with leaders of the African American Chamber, the Asian Chamber, et cetera, and had a nice lunch to kind of talk about different things that the city can do to increase economic diversity within the city. We're also working on creating kind of a comprehensive list of the businesses that we do have already existing. We have pretty many, believe it or not, that are minority or even women owned and led. So we are working to create a list like that. It would be more of a voluntary list if people wanted to register on that so that we can promote those businesses through our social media channels and website. But we are also continuing to brainstorm different ideas and ways to increase economic diversity, but also to just make sure that people know who's already out there and to frequent those businesses.
Thank you. We have another question, and this is for whoever wants to field it. What would you recommend to reduce poverty levels in Hamilton County?
Well, I'll take a first shot because one of my other areas that I'm passionate about and very involved in is early childhood education. I think it starts in the families. So when we have parents that are either single parents or come from kids that come from abusive homes, whatever that abuse could be, physical, mental, whatever, those students are starting way behind. And when they have a chance to be in high quality childcare, preschools, before they start kindergarten, and then what we call kindergarten ready, which means socially, socially, emotionally, and educational. Because if some of those pieces are missing, they're not going to get the whole picture. They are 10 times more likely to graduate, so you don't need remedial education. You don't need the justice system involved on the back end. So the more money that we can put into early childhood education, we've seen enough studies now in the last 5 years that show a return on investment of 7 to 13% because you're not putting money in the back end of it. So that's something that I am very involved in advocacy in both Kentucky and Ohio in the legislatures. And we've been very fortunate. I think with the recent COVID money, $40 billion is going to that just out of the latest one that was passed. And the current governor and legislature have passed more funds for that as well. So I believe that'll have a tremendous impact. It also gives their parents a chance to work, because COVID put many of them out of work. So the ones that even want to return, if their childcare centers aren't open, they can't return. So we need to get them back open, and they go back to work, and then they aren't worried about their children rather, and the children are getting the education that they need. So that's one major piece, in my opinion, of the puzzle of reducing poverty in Hamilton County.
And just to piggyback on what Chris said, absolutely jobs need to be available. Opportunities need to be out there. You don't get out of poverty without having some opportunity, for benefits, healthcare. It's a huge component that the low income isn't readily available to. Another component of that is also, safe and stable sanitary housing. I think we can go a long way if we're committing Hamilton County to developing programs for low income, even middle income household, retired nurses, teachers, whoever out there that have been our true lifeblood of our economy for so long. Safe, stable housing goes a long way.
Thank you. Any other questions? Got another one here. Sorry, I was going to get the slides. We're going to publish, we recorded this presentation, so our plan is to publish this on the city website, on the diversity and inclusion page, and also on our social media channel. So keep an eye out on that. All righty. Well, Chris and Dell, thank you very much. This was really, really informative, and thank you everybody for attending. And just keep your eye out in the Montgomery Bulletin and social media, and we'll be publishing our next Know Your Neighbor series. Not quite sure when that's going to take place yet, but it's in the works. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Have a great night.